Hey, what's up, guys? I want to say a massive thank you to everybody who took the original audio test. The results were fascinating, to say the least. If you didn't see the original test, I'll link it in the video right now. And for everybody else, let's jump right into the results. The test was broken into 3 sections. Let's start with the first, which was comparing the new Oculus audio system's binaural sound enabled versus disabled in side-by-side identical situations. In each example, you were told where the sound was actually coming from, and then asked to choose which of the samples best matched that expectation. Now, I gotta say that in all of my initial testing, I was entirely unable to tell any difference between binaural on versus off, which was pretty much exactly the opposite of my experience with Steam Audio from past wipes. The problem, though, was that people were constantly telling me that they could tell a difference with the new system's binaural setting on versus off, and that one was better than the other. So before I jumped to any conclusions, I did what any good scientist would do, blind the tests and let the data do the talking. Now first, imagine a situation where rather than making one of them binaural on and one of them binaural off, I instead just played the same exact setting for both A and B. Now my expectation is that over hundreds or thousands of responses is that the majority of people, let's say 60 or 70%, would answer that there was no difference between the two, but some subset of people would get it in their head that there was some subtle difference between one or the other and would want to go with their gut or something like that. So we'd likely see a fairly even split of the remaining people between A and B, even though once again they were effectively the same thing. Now if my original base hypothesis is correct, that the binaural sound setting had no effect on the resulting sound at all, then the result we saw from these examples would match that sort of pattern. Well, it just so happens that I tested every aspect of that here, including my assumption of what the results would be if I asked people to choose from 2 identical comparisons. Now the first question of section 1 was just this. Different jumps both with binaural sound off, so there shouldn't be any difference at all. Now the majority of people, 58%, correctly said that there was no difference. Although that means that the remaining 42% thought there was a difference when none was present. Now of those people, more than twice as many thought that B sounded more behind, and my guess is that it has something to do with B being played second, so maybe the order has something to do with it. Either way, this confirms my initial suspicion, and we can reference this kind of split as we move on. Now looking at the results for number 2, 3, 5, and 6, we can see a similar sort of answer distribution, with no difference between binaural on and off being the most common answer, with the remaining minority unable to decide which was better. Now note that in these examples, because both options are technically correct, there were no wrong answers here, so sorry to burst the bubbles of anybody excited that they aced section 1. Now I did throw a little bit of a curveball. Questions number 4 and 7 were a couple special cases I tossed in here for good measure. They were actually audio samples from last wipe with Steam Audio's binaural sound on versus off. Now, if you haven't seen what's basically my magnum opus, my incredibly in-depth video that I did on sound last year, you should. Even though we no longer have Steam Audio in the game, I promise that you'll gain a ton of perspective and there's going to be a lot that you're going to learn. Now, the samples I used for 4 and 7 were ones that I used in my video last year, and at the time I highly recommended enabling Steam Audio's binaural sound in Tarkov because I believed it to be massively better for sound localization, especially for front and back. Now, the results from my previous test demonstrated that to be the case, and they did for this as well. Now, compared to the previous comparisons with binaural on versus off, where most of the people said there wasn't any difference and there wasn't really a clear determination between whether A or B was better, in both 4 and 7, where we compared Tarkov's old audio, one without Steam Audio's binaural sound setting enabled, and one with it enabled, we had clear winners. Now overall, combined with my personal experience and all of the testing I did that didn't make it into this, I'm fairly confident that the binaural sound setting with Oculus Audio as it is in the game currently right now in patch 0.13 has no effect on the in-game sound at all. Now this information has been passed on to Nikita, and he's passed on the video and the results to the sound team to analyze. Now given that there are allegedly performance costs to running binaural sound on, not to mention that it doesn't seem like it's going to benefit you all in any way, I'd recommend turning it off right now, but again, at any point they might fix it and make it amazing, and my recommendations would then change. If that happens, I'll likely make a video on it. So now, moving on to sections 2 and 3, All of the examples in section 2 are with binaural sound off, and all of the examples in section 3 are exactly identical to the examples in section 2, just with the order mixed up a bit and with binaural sound turned on. Now, given that I don't believe binaural audio does anything at all to the sound, as I just mentioned, and that Oculus audio without working binaural audio doesn't provide enough auditory context to tell the difference between front, back, above, and below in most cases, my hypothesis was that for most of these examples, the responses would be effectively consistent with random chance. Meaning that if a question asked you to identify if the source of the sound was in front of you or behind you, the responses would be pretty damn close to 50-50 in most cases, with some caveats. If there is in fact no difference between front and back, then really what I interpret that to mean is that the sounds behind you sound just like they're in front of you. So technically, I would expect much more than 50% of the individual questions would be answered correctly, where the correct answer was that the sound was coming from in front. And much more than 50% would get it wrong when behind you was the correct answer. Although overall, I suspect that these would average out to a fairly even split when you combine them all together. Now this is basically what we saw. All of these graphs, the green bar indicates the correct answer. As you can see, the vast majority of these are pretty damn close to 50-50, effectively meaning that people can't tell the damn difference between front and back. Any of the ones that have a little bit more of a significant distribution, I'd say there's just as many where the majority of people are correct as there are ones where the majority of people are incorrect. Now, as I mentioned before, there's a number of psychological elements that I think will affect people's answers, largely determined by the order of the questions. Now, in my opinion, these kinds of things speak to the weakness and ambiguity of the audio as it is in the game right now. Because if the audio was more clear and compelling in one way or another, these kinds of circumstances would not affect the results as significantly as they clearly do. For example, if you start with sound samples that are in front of you, when the audio is clear and sounds like what most people would expect if it was coming from in front of you, then if you play another sound sample that's located in front of you, but it's in a slightly different situation, like let's say you're indoors and the footsteps are a little bit more distant, that contrast in volume and partial occlusion is likely going to be enough to make people think that it could be behind you instead. You're not actually getting any direct information from the audio itself. All you're able to do is try to infer based on what you've heard in past examples. Now, we see this exact thing in questions 1, 2, and 3 in section 2. In all three of them, the audio was coming from in front of you, and most people correctly said in front for the first two, but then a significant portion incorrectly answered behind for the third, even though it was in the front, because in this situation, again, the footsteps were more distant, and there was some partial occlusion between being outdoors versus indoors. Let me also just toss in here an unedited portion of the testing where I can show you the difference between front and back, or I guess lack of a difference. Now, a couple of standout cases that were a bit more unique were the examples where you were asked to determine if the player in the same building as you was on the same level, above you, or below you. Now, all of these examples were taken while you were located inside of the factory third floor office. There were 3 cases compared here. One with the player in the third floor hallway running around while the door was open, one with the player running in the same way in the third floor hallway but the door was closed, and one with the player running on the first floor. Now, as most of you know, there's nothing above the third floor office and factory, so all the answers that said above were clearly incorrect. It's interesting to see how many people were unable to tell the difference between a couple floors below and some amount of floors above. Now, in my opinion, it was fairly easy to determine if they were on the same level as you when the door was open, because that's basically just like the normal audio that you would expect. But I find it fascinating how many people didn't realize the steps you heard when the door were closed were on the same level. The the vast majority of the responses incorrectly believed that the footsteps were either above or below, despite being on the same floor. Now, this jives with my personal experience. I feel like the door being closed occludes the audio a bit too much, and there have been a number of cases where the sounds in Factory, a map that I have tens of thousands of raids on, have been really ambiguous and confusing. Now, perhaps this is a case where we just need to get used to it, but I think there's also a lot of tweaking that needs to be done to make it more natural and intuitive sounding in all of these different situations. Now, I did sneak in one more Steam Audio example in the last test, number 11, in section 3, which directly followed a nearly identical Oculus Audio example, both where people were running behind the player. Now, I still have people telling me Steam Audio was bad before and Oculus Audio is amazing now for 3D localization. It's true that BSG's old occlusion system resulted in you not hearing things in many situations when you should have, although note that Steam Audio had nothing to do with occlusion, by the way, at that time. The new occlusion, that I can only guess is some combination of their old base audio occlusion and the Oculus occlusion, often does not occlude sounds you shouldn't hear at all, or doesn't nearly occlude them enough, which can lead to extremely confusing moments in raids.
Sprinting. You're sprinting closer? Oh yeah, it's...
Yeah, sounds a bit fucked in the game right now.
Yeah.
They really, I don't know what they're doing.
You sound a lot closer than you...
Than I am. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. It sounds like it's right next to you.
I would argue that these examples are far worse than the ghost sounds people used to complain about with Steam Audio, but that's of course my subjective opinion.
He's at the wall. He's at the goddamn wall!
Either way, regarding determining the difference between front and back audio without any additional context, comparing Steam Audio and Oculus, I think the results that I got here speak for themselves. Now, the last case I haven't yet talked about was the case in which I asked if the player was above you, below you, in front of you, or behind you. Now, in all of these examples, I was standing in the lobby of one of these buildings here, and my teammate was basically running around in circles on the second floor right above me. Because of the occlusion and the phasing or something about the audio, I personally find this really ambiguous, and I think that the community results back this up. Now finally, before I show you some of the testing I did that didn't make it into the video for one reason or another, but still demonstrates some of the bugs, weirdness, and ambiguity I personally find in the new system, I'm going to ask once more that you consider subscribing to the channel, turning on notifications when new videos like this come out in the future, and also please consider supporting me on Patreon. Think about what I'm trying to do here. I'm attempting to educate the community while at the same time providing entertainment, as well as supporting evidence and constructive criticism for serious issues with the game. Specific issues that nobody else is talking about and potentially nobody would have known about or believed without this kind of work. I'm not turning these major bugs into clickbait drama news videos. I'm not trying to stir up controversy for clicks. I genuinely believe I'm doing the best work I can for the Tarkov community and for the game itself. And if you agree, please consider becoming a patron. It'll keep me motivated to continue doing more like this in the future. I hope all of you had a fantastic holiday and a happy new year. Thanks for watching.